What other brilliance do I want here? Select by location.
There it is.
I will now call the joint meeting of the Brookings City Planning Commission and Brookings County Planning Commission to order. First item on our agenda is a roll call. So, Mike, would you note the roll?
Roll has been noted.
And I'll call the county side to order. First item of business for us is approval of agenda. Motion Bartley, second Erickson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
And second item of business on the city side, approval of the agenda. I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Second.
That's a motion from Jorgensen, a second from Musburger. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Thank you. Third item on the city agenda is the approval of the minutes from last meeting, and trusting that everyone has had a chance to look over those, I will entertain a motion for approval. All right, motion Rasmussen, second Mills. All in favor signify by saying aye. And all opposed say no. Great.
And on the county side, approval of minutes, is there a motion?
So move.
Erickson motion. Bartley second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passed.
All right. Down to other business. Item 4A is discussion and review on updating joint jurisdiction zoning ordinance draft. And so I guess Luke and Peyton, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you, and good evening again. I will tell you that I have, I think it'll hurt your feelings to know that I'm leaving at 7:30, regardless of whether we're done or not, so hopefully we're done by then. Bottom line is that's as long as I've got to be here tonight, and so hopefully that's a discussion. We've got really one item to tackle here today. We had planned on getting through, or hoped to get through, the idea of wellhead protection district. I got bogged down in a couple of questions, and rather than try to haste through them last meeting, decided to punt those couple of questions here for this meeting. And so that's really where we'll start. Richard, this was on and now it decided to stop? Your screen is not so much working now. Is there a way to get me back on? That is good. I are plugged in.
It was working earlier.
It was. Let me think. Well, it was on. Here, let's just play with it. Do over. There she goes. Yeah, we're good. I didn't even have to swear at it. All right, so you'll recall we started going through point by point. It became clear for the most part. We talked about all of the, what I'm going to call some of the ancillary topics, and got down to what I would call the main points, which is we pointed out Zone B of the Aquifer Protection District, which is the areas in lavender on that map. Let me take the floodplain off of there to kind of make it easier to follow. Be the areas in lavender on that map. Really not a lot of change. It's being regulated the same as it is in the rest of the county. Outside of the joint jurisdiction area, frankly, because the county is regulating that throughout the rest of the county, trying to keep it as uniform as possible. Wellhead Protection District, as I pointed out last meeting, had a lot of discussion on that at the subcommittee level, and ultimately, what we found was that a lot of the discussion that we had at the subcommittee level, we had discussion here as well. There were some questions on, we got bogged down at, should it be a permitted use or a conditional use to replace an existing house within the wellhead protection area, which is the area, it's the area that is with the highlighted, what I'm going to call the teal colored highlighted uses within it. I did miss these two up here, but there are two cell towers up in this area as well. But the real area of focus was in this area. And a lot of the discussion went down as far as the uses we had. Sounded like everything was okay. But let's just get to it. I'll stop talking and leave where it was. There were concerns about should it be a permitted use or should it be a conditional use to replace an existing house sitting on that site. So I'm going to start and open it if anyone has anything to discuss as far as a replacement of existing houses out there. Or actually, let me start here. I think we're all on the same page, but I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, okay? How does everyone feel about the aspect of if there's not a house there, they're not going to get to build a house? Is there anyone not comfortable with that? Okay, well, that checks off one of the questions I had for today. That's good. So from that aspect, that question's already done, and the way the draft is written, it's good. So we're set there. So let's go to the next one. Go ahead, this would be the time to discuss how you feel about the idea of restricting, limiting, and I'm going to start and dovetail this into two questions. I'm going to start with, in the event we have a calamity, an act of God, house burns down, blows away, falls down for that matter, and they want to rebuild the house. The initial draft had that situation as a conditional use to rebuild, and it was to rebuild only as the size that it was. We discussed, and I think we really got to a point where it was likely to be that reconstruction would have been okay as long as it was within 25% of the size. I think that's really where we were. And we got bogged down kind of at the point, should that be a permitted use, a by right use? Come in, get a building permit, or should I have to go to the Board of Adjustment? And so that's where that's where we'll pick it back up from last time. Is there anyone that still feels like that should be a conditional use to do that?
I'd call you Mr. Chairman, but you're not. So, listen, we discussed this at length in the subcommittee, and one of the points that I brought out at that time that I think is still valid at this point is that if we allow it as a permitted use, it protects the property owner's rights. If we have to make them come in for a conditional use and we deny it, it's almost an involuntary takings at that point, where you've taken the right of the property owner who bought the property whenever they bought it to maintain the use of that property as a single-family residence or whatever use they were using. So I don't have a problem with the 25% increase, but at the same time, I have a problem with taking away that right to rebuild in that particular property as a takings, so to speak. So. And I think that's some of the discussion we had in the subcommittee too, is we had to be a little bit careful that we're not restricting the property owner's rights to use their property in the manner that they're accustomed to using it for. We can certainly restrict that they can't expand, and because we can do that, but they can't rebuild without a conditional use that is subjective. I'm not in favor of that.
I have a comment too. I was sitting back here behind and didn't say much last meeting, but a lot of them farms and a lot of them houses have been there longer than the wells have. And if you start telling these people what they can and cannot do with their property, they were there first. And all of a sudden they can't do things with their property, and you have seriously devalued their property. If you want to compensate them and buy their property from them so they move somewhere else at their own free will, that's fine. But I don't like the idea of telling them what they can't do.
So from the standpoint, is there anyone who, is there anyone who feels like, Commissioner Bartley, you were saying that you think it should be a permitted use to rebuild as well. Is there anyone who feels like we should leave that as a conditional use, that we shouldn't put it as a permitted use? To rebuild in the event of a calamity?
Talking about rebuilding right now the residents, and we're going to talk separately again about structures, right?
Yes. Right now, we're just solely the dwellings, the residents. So silence tells me that most everyone's on board with the idea of rebuilding as a permitted use. Awesome. That takes care of that question.
I have a question. though.
Yeah.
You're talking about only in the case of a disaster. What about just the house is worn out and I want to replace
I-
it with the same size?
I did say that that's not right. If it falls down, or even if in this, I got to look at. I should ask that actually here. I want to make sure of that. That is a separate question. Take it down. I don't like my house. I want to rebuild. I just want to do over. Or I bought this lot. I don't like the ranch house. I want a different setup of my ranch house. I knock it down. I build it up again. Is that okay? As long as it's the same size or within 25%?
Within the 25% rule, I think you control somebody taking down a small ranch and building a mansion.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as it's not twice the size or something like that, right? Okay.
With that deal on the liking it and doing that, the other thing we ran into last time was decks. Okay, with us and lake property, is that permitted use, or would they be able to apply for a conditional use for a deck
way-
expansion?
You're way ahead of me.
Okay.
That's my next question. So I just want to be clear. Are we okay with the idea someone takes it down and rebuilds it of their own volition? Not just tornado or fire, but just take down and rebuild as long as it's within 25% of house is a house. I think that's reasonable. Okay. Replacement. I just gotta write good notes here so I remember. All right. Next question. The next question is exactly what Commissioner Ford had asked, and so the next question, and right now, we do not have a provision that would allow additions onto any structure in the draft that we have. There's no ability to add on to any structure within the wellhead protection district. Again, that's that whatever color you would call that, plum, we'll call it, on that map that is highlighted there. And for those who are just here, haven't been there, there's the two up there, and then we pointed out this layer here, this area here, straight east of town, will be going away. That won't be a wellhead protection district anymore. So here's a question. Should it be prohibited, a conditional use, or by right use to be able to expand an existing structure in that area? And I'm going to really stick right now with house stuff, be it a house or a garage on a lot out there. I want to stick with residential question first because I want to double back on ag buildings here in a little bit. Where do you feel? Should that remain prohibited? Or should they be allowed to expand up to 25%? And if so, how? Not all at once.
I'm not sure how to word it, but I don't think we're worried about decks. But garages, we'd be worried what's getting stored in the garage, or if you're gonna put a whole other stall on. I don't know how so leaving it conditional use at least gives us an opportunity to evaluate
What it's going to be used
what
for.
it's gonna be used for.
And I think if you look at it realistically, there aren't any decks that I'd be concerned about with the aquifer as much as or the well protection area as I would be adding 25% to the structure of the house. We're talking strictly the house, and I want to add a 3-stall garage to a 2-stall garage and make it 5 stalls. That use in 3 or additional garages attached to the structure could be used to store chemicals and things that we wouldn't want in that area. So I think the 25% rule applies to the structure of the house, which would include a garage. I'm not necessarily concerned about a deck as much as I am garages in excess of the 25% rule that we'd proposed.
So from a standpoint of additions onto a principal structure, be it a house, in this case, I'll quit saying principal structure because we're talking about houses. 25 up to a 25% expansion on an existing house.
By conditional use.
Your conditional use is on the house, right?
By expansion, not, again, not now, I'm not talking about replacement
Yes,
after.
yeah, we've disposed of the replacement
Okay.
question. Let's go to flat out expansion. I've got a house sitting there that was built in 1972. Want to build a 12 by 14 addition onto it.
And I think it should be a conditional use as much from the standpoint of future control that if it's a conditional use, it's 25% increase over what exists as of the date of the ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way you keep track of it, and because you'd have a conditional use process that would have happened one time to expand it by 25%, it would not be allowed to be expand another 25% at any point in the future, because you'd have it, again, you'd have the clear record of what happened. Also, why I would like to see conditional use is what's already been said. You can, that way you can find out a little bit more about what the plan is, as opposed to a permitted use, which is just a building permit.
Now, from your standpoint, you're talking about the house, though.
Yeah.
Still, right? Okay.
Yeah, I'm still talking about, dwelling,
Yep. Okay.
which, in my vision, dwelling includes like a accessory structure for a garage.
Attached.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
How about septic systems?
Let's hold that thought. I want to come back to that because I was thinking about that. I didn't have great notes. We talked about that last time, but I do want to come back to that. Let's hold that thought, though, and stick with just expansion of the structure itself, okay? So building additions onto it. We've heard conditional use.
I just want to clarify, because we said we would allow, the previous question was we were thinking you could decide to tear down your house and rebuild it.
Yep.
And within that, we were okay with 25% expansion. But here we're saying to just do an expansion would be a conditional use.
Right
Is that
now,
correct?
That's what the last comment was, yeah.
Okay.
On the expansion, is it 25% of the floor area of all floors combined of just finished square footage, or is it of just the main level?
You are getting to what was going to be part 2C of my question. I think I want to get to, here's the bottom line. If your answer is you want this to be a conditional use, that's fantastic. Okay, that's fine. Doesn't bother me. I need to know what you're going to say no to. And if you don't know, if you just want the ability to track it, or in a standpoint, or from a standpoint of what Mike Struck had said last time, from the standpoint of things change over time, and we don't know what we're going to know in 10 years, but we do want the chance to look at it. That's fine. We might change our land use plan for all we know in that amount of time. That might be it. But I need to know if there's a keep this professional. If there's a reason that you would need to say no, or a question you specifically want answered each time, let's know it. And one of those is literally, what does 25% mean? Does it mean cubic contents, or does that mean just of main floor? What is that? So going back to that, before we jump immediately to what would the conditions be, I want to make sure that this is a conditional use first, as far as everyone goes. I've got two that have said it. I've got a handful of head nods.
Would
Is
you like
that
a show
a
of
conditional
hands?
use?
Show
You want to just
hands?
go it?
Yep.
Would someone, let's do that. Who feels like an expansion of up to 25% of the house and attached garage should be a permitted use? Permitted use. I tricked you. All right.
Tricky.
Uh-huh. Who feels like it should be a conditional use?
I have no problem with that.
Okay. There, that was fun. So took care of that question. So now, let's go back to the first question. Do you feel like that should be a gross floor area question? Meaning, I add the upstairs and the downstairs and perhaps the basement, and also the garage, or is that just the footprint of the structure?
Is there a standard in the profession on how that's determined when you look at 25% of a existing structure
We typically go by value on non-conforming.
by value?
Yeah, if you have a structure that's destroyed by a certain percentage of the value, so that's not going to work. So then you go for an area. What do you go by on your 25% for yours, Mike? Put you on the spot. You sent me the language, and I didn't memorize it.
I can look it up real quickly, but I believe it's either the main floor area, because if it's a unfinished basement, we wouldn't necessarily count that. I'll look it up real quick and confirm it.
I'm inclined to say that that's right too, because in communities, I mean, you could have old buildings in which you're going to be counting attic space.
And it doesn't include the garage.
Well, does it? I mean,
Ours does not include the garage.
Okay,
For the
yours does
city,
not?
it's the primary residential structure. It does not include garage space.
So you would go 25% of primary of the house itself.
Everything above ground, so if it's a two-story house, just the first floor.
I think what he's saying is footprint, main floor.
Footprint is what I would
Yeah.
think. I mean, how else would you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's,
I mean,
then you
be
get back to value.
Be a
Well,
nightmare.
The only other way to do it is first and second floor. If it's one of the older two-story farmhouses, it's a pretty small footprint to rebuild on unless you build a two-story house again. But if I want to put a ranch in, I can combine the two floors and put a ranch out. It's the same number of square footage living space. You might, not a lot of people are building two stories anymore out there. They're building ranch styles.
Richard, I know you looked up some of the houses out there. Were there any that were
Two-story?
1900 to 1920 out there?
Not in the two strips along the Township Road and Highway 14,
Okay.
but there is some structures, farmhouses out there that are deeded off separately, that are two-story farmhouses out there.
Yeah, I mean, I know if
There's
they're modeled after
4 to
those old,
5 maybe, just rough guess. There might be more or less, but
those old Sears Roebuck houses were somewhere between 500 and 700, and a lot of them were modeled after that. Sorry, I should lean forward. So a lot of them were modeled after that two-story, 700 square foot main floor thing.
Luke,
Um,
the city's regulations on non-conforming, it's 25% of the gross floor area, excluding the basement.
Oh, so you do count upstairs?
We do count upstairs.
Okay.
That makes sense.
25% of gross
Otherwise, I got to.
Gross floor area, excluding the basement.
and the garage.
No.
So, 25% gross floor area excluding basement and garage?
Okay.
Going once?
I would think if they had a finished basement, you'd have to include the basement too.
If it's finished?
I would say finished space.
then I think you need to get into defining finished space.
Yeah, are there any finished basements in the area we're talking about?
Might be. Some of the
I
newer
mean,
homes.
remember, we're not talking the whole county here, we're talking
This
few
area.
houses that, the dots up there. That's all we're talking about here. We're not talking along a lake, we're not talking anywhere else.
Right.
So that's why before we get bogged down in something like that, let's make sure we know what we're talking about.
Well, you got to remember there, as you move north in the region, your elevation increases, creating more likelihood of having a basement.
Yeah, but are any of these have a basement? I guess that's what, do we know if any of the houses that are there, because we're only talking about ones that are there, we're not talking about future houses. There can be no future houses.
Would your guesstimate be that there are no basements because it's in the wellhead area and water
That
table's
would
high?
be I mean, I don't want to penalize anybody either. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to, I mean, before we get bogged down with the discussion point, is it even worth talking about? Because if there are no basements that are finished, then let's not worry about it.
But if there is, you're reducing. If there is, and he wants to rebuild, you're reducing his footprint by that amount in the basement versus the other person who does not. So actually, you are making the house smaller if he cannot rebuild to the size of his finished basement. It's not included in there.
Well, but we're only talking, I mean, Rich, we're talking about an increase here, not talking about taking anything away. This is not, the discussion right here is not about rebuilding. This is about adding on.
Correct.
So we
But
can
if he
add-
included a finished basement in there and all of a sudden you say, no, we can't do that, include basements, like what was discussed earlier, you said do not include the basements. But if his basement is finished, he should be able to include that square footage in there.
If he has 1,000 square foot finished basement, 1,000 square foot main floor, and 1,000 square foot upstairs, third floor.
Right.
He's got 3,000 square foot of finished space, but if you disinclude the basement, all you're allowing him to rebuild is 2,500 square feet.
We're not talking about rebuilding here.
Well,
This is not,
but-
no, this has nothing to do with, oh, I see what you're saying, okay.
Because we got to double that.
25%, yeah, it's got to be the same
That's
way.
what we're getting
Okay,
at.
I get it.
So
All right, yeah, okay.
It wouldn't have to be apples to apples, section to section, but it will be confusing as heck to explain.
And, yeah,
I mean, heck, it
we
was
wouldn't want to
here.
have it different, would we?
Yeah. So
I think I just quickly looked at like 3 properties that are east of Brookings that are highlighted. A full basement, a 3/4 basement, and and I'm waiting for this one to pull up. But there are basements over there.
yeah, you may have to.
And we have 2 full basements and 3/4 of the 3 properties that I looked at.
Maybe you could add language, finished basement as assessed,
Finished gross floor area as assessed.
because we'd have that information in the equalization office, whether it was taxed as finished or not.
All right, I gotta do my job here. Do we require permits for finishing a basement in this area? Right now, do you require a finish? Okay. So reality is they're all finished.
No
then.
building permit to refinish a basement.
No, right now in the county, there is no building permit for finishing a basement.
That's pretty standard too. So basically, you would go by assessed at the time then.
I think
Is what you'd
it's
have
the
to do.
fairest way to do it is by assessment.
That's what you'd have to do, is by assessed, is what you'd have to do.
I'm not sure that I understood, but in the example that you used, 1,000 foot, 1,000 foot, and 1,000 foot, square foot on each floor. So that's 3,000. So you would get, did I do my math right? You could have 1,500, no, it'd be 750 square foot addition?
Yep.
Does that size bother anybody?
No.
I'm just curious.
It's probably not going to demand an expanded septic system to handle it.
We're very close to Terrell's question here now, but I want to get to, are there any other red flags off the top of your head that, if this happened, I'm not letting them expand that house? Is there anything else? Because I'd like to put that in as a condition if possible.
Walk me through one more time. If I just want to add one more stall to my garage, where does that fit into this?
At this point, I hadn't asked that question yet. But let's ask that one first. Let's ask that one first. Is this just the? Are we all settled on this is just the house, not a garage, not an attached garage? Or do you think that they should be allowed to add on to the attached garage too as a part of this? As a conditional use? Is it adding on to your garage prohibited or is it a conditional use?
Well, I would think that you could add on to their garage. Most people just store a car in a garage, and a car is better off in a garage as far as, fuel leaks and that kind of stuff than it would be if it was sitting outside. If it's not in the garage, it's just going to be sitting out on the ground where everything goes right straight into the ground. I don't know why they should be limited to how big a garage they can have.
So if it was a conditional use, you could stipulate that there's a trap and a floor drain, that sort of thing, on that. And honestly, you could do that as a permitted use too. That's a performance standard. But if you want to see that, verify, see the whites of their eyes when they promise to do it, that would make sense from that standpoint. Treat that as a way to handle it.
Any garage expansion should probably be a conditional use because you want to know what the use is of the garage and whether the floor is concrete or dirt.
Then you get a chance to review that. All right. Let me get to the question of septic tanks. I was of the impression in looking at this that we had new septic tanks being a prohibited use in the wellhead protection district. I don't see it right now. Was it your intent that new septic tanks be prohibited uses in the wellhead protection district? Before you answer, I do want to clarify that state law doesn't necessarily preclude that. They have a way that there are ways of creating means of septic and drain fields. However, it doesn't mean you can't be more restrictive.
Well, except for replacement of homes that have been destroyed, maybe you might have to replace whatever you're using for your septic. There shouldn't be any new ones. Is that?
There really shouldn't be a need to, but that's where I'm going with that is if I have a case where, and let's just jump to that question because logic is going to tell me that there's probably not going to be a need for that. What if it fails and they need to replace it? Can they replace it? Or does it have to be replaced with a sealed holding tank or something else of that nature? Because that's where I'm trying to go to. Is it flat out prohibited, or is it only allowed to be replaced? That's that question of tolerate versus prohibit.
Well, I think we have to allow people to replace their septic system if they have a house there and it goes bad. But what is the most environmentally protective thing that utilities would recommend for that? Anybody know the answer? That wasn't in the draft. Nothing.
There was nothing about the. It basically reads more or less what you just described. Is that replacement is okay, is what it amounts to. But there wasn't anything specific about prohibiting over the wellhead, treating it any differently than, frankly, the rest of the county.
So most septic systems are replaced today in that particular area, I would guess, would have a North Dakota system.
Would have what?
What they call a North Dakota system. It's a mound and evaporative system rather than a leaching system. Got one in my backyard.
Perhaps the replacement issue should be based on capacity of the system. If you're going to replace one, it has to be the same capacity and design of that capacity.
In that case, you'd probably be better off to have it the same or larger, or capable of handling more than less, wouldn't you? So that you are overbuilt, if nothing else. So it'd be, as opposed to trying to limit them to a smaller septic, you'd maybe want to be able to limit them to ability to handle more in that case. So you're more or less say that the minimum that they can reinstall is what they had. Again, I am by no means an expert on septic installations here, so.
When the county revised the Lake Park District and put in we did quite a bit of work on that and what's allowed in Lake Park. Can you pull that up, Richard? Are you able to look to see what we said there?
And that we did would follow the administrative rules for septic systems on there, and which nowadays septic systems are no longer buried deep for their drain fields to run out either onto the surface or deep into the ground. Nowadays, they need to do percolation tests on them, need to be certified by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to be a certified septic system installer. And most times, in cases for a regular septic system, the drain field can be no deeper than 4 feet. And it evaporates up, percolates up, does not go down. Just like the North Dakota there, or there's what they call a mound system where they pile the dirt far on top of the ground and they have the drain field going through that. So it goes up that way, but it is all regulated by the South Dakota Department of Environment and Natural Resources through their administrative rules section.
But wouldn't that apply? I mean, since that's state law, that would trump anything we're doing anyway. Isn't that what would have to happen, Richard? I mean,
Yes,
so
they would have to be installed by a certified installer to the latest rules under the administrative rules sections.
I mean, I guess that's why I'm a little bit at a loss here. Why are we even?
The real question is, do you want to be more restrictive? That's the real question.
I don't think we need to be more restrictive than those experts. I mean, they're the experts.
Okay.
I mean, for us to say more restrictive than DENR, I see no reason to do that.
Good, because I didn't have a justification for
I
doing
don't
it.
see the utilities running sewer out there for those houses, so.
And in the Lake Park District, there's only a certain type of holding system you can use now. But I can't remember what it is, I'm sorry.
Right. In the Lake Park district right now, if your septic tank fails, you need to, and your lot is not large enough, you need to put in a sealed holding tank where they come out and pump it out once a week, once a month, however big your capacity is. Then they haul it out.
So, I feel like we've pretty well opened this question on dwellings up, haven't we? We're there as far as dwellings, aren't we? Are there any other questions on expanding, replacing dwellings? Septic tanks sounds like replace what's there
Eric, do
according to state law.
do you want language in there, Eric, that basically states it has to be a state certified system for replacement?
Well, I guess, but wouldn't that apply? And that, I guess, Mike, that's what I'm saying. Wouldn't that apply whether we say it or not?
It does.
Well, it may apply, but if I'm reading the ordinance,
state law
I
is
don't know
going to
that,
trump
and it says
anything
it,
we
then
say
I
or
know
don't
it.
say.
If it says it in there, then I know it. If I didn't know that ahead of time.
I'd really like Mike maybe to talk to utilities and at our next meeting say this is how utilities would like that part to read, because I think they'll have some definite opinion on that.
Well, Mike,
Oh, I
Eric's
didn't-
here.
oh,
I mean,
I
he's the
didn't
guy
see
right
that.
here.
Sorry.
Eric,
Sorry.
Speak up. Come up. Just come up here and just introduce yourself and say whoever, what you're thinking.
Eric Witt, I'm the water manager at BMU. On the topic of septic tanks, we've talked about that a lot internally. In a perfect world, a sealed holding tank in the wellhead zone A would be a preference, but I actually think it's almost too much to ask without us figuring out a way to participate. So I'm okay with septic system replacement in kind to current code.
In kind to current code.
Okay. Yeah. That's the word. That's the word I was looking for.
What's that?
Current code.
Any questions?
That'll work. Okay. Let's start this question over again now. So the next item that generated some discussion within the subcommittee, and there are basically two on this topic. And this doubles back to basically same question now on ag uses. And I don't think there's no one really had a problem within the subcommittee as far as concentrated animal feeding operations, feeding animals, that sort of thing, being limited, prohibited from the wellhead protection district. Question was on egg structures. This ordinance here prohibits any structures that are not a house or that are not the replacement of the house or the expansion now of that house by 25%. Is everyone okay with that fact that as of now, the way it's written, you wouldn't be allowed to replace grain bins or commodity sheds in that area or build any new ones for that matter?
Can you tell us again how many of those types of structures are in that area?
I can tell you that exclusively grain bins, there are, let's see here, one site that is exclusively grain bins, egg residence. There are 3 at least that would have some sort of egg structure there. So realistically, yeah, we're talking about 5. Yeah, it would be easier for me to look up here, wouldn't it? 1, 2, 3. Grain bins is 4, probably 7. 7 that I could tell you off the top of my head just by looking at this.
7
would have that-
sites where there's
7
something.
sites, yeah, today that would have them to be replaced. That does not go along with, that does not state the number of parcels that are ag used out there. Someone may or may not have bought for that purpose. And so that's just, I want to be clear with everyone that Richard is going to have to tell them no if they want to apply for a building permit for a grain bin on these lots. Or the shed to store, be it something that's simple and maybe not a big deal, like seed corn, or something that is a big deal, like a combine that could have a lot of fuel in a fuel tank and that sort of thing on there, which again, that's limited. So bottom line is that right now, the way it's written, Richard's telling them no. Is that okay?
What's a grain bin hurt to rebuild or build? I mean, you're talking footings, concrete, and steel. There's no septic issue with a grain bin. There's really nothing that should do anything to pollute the wellhead area in a grain bin. I guess I don't understand why they're not allowed to be rebuilt or constructed, because it's pretty simple structure.
From what I remember, the standpoint was to discourage basically any sort of new structures in that area. That's all I recall from the discussion.
I think that is accurate, that if there's not structures there, you wouldn't want to encourage any new structures to be built within the Zone A.
Yeah, and Luca, I just want to make sure, are we talking about new structures or replacement of something that gets wrecked?
At this point, I'm talking about either.
I think we should distinguish between the two.
Let's start with replacement at this point.
I mean, the way I read the draft that's come to us to date would, by conditional use, a grain bin could be rebuilt if it was destroyed. By conditional use. That's the way I read what we have right now.
It does say reconstruction of, here, I've got to look at it here, actually. I had this. It does too. as of now, it does say reconstruction of structures in existence as of the date provided in the application, made within 1 year of removal or destruction of the structure, could be applied for as a conditional use. So, you're
That's
right.
item 3 in that
Yep.
section 02. It ends
Yep.
up being
So,
02.
307
Yeah, you right there. You've
Yep.
got it up there.
3070602 number 3 does say that you could replace any existing grain bins. So that was my mistake. It does say that you could replace them as a conditional use. It would require a conditional use to do so. And so,
Do we need to address the size of the structure? I get a small grain bin tips over and I want to put up a 3 times the size. Is it still an existing structure? Is it within 25% of the original? Just leave it alone.
I say leave it the same size.
Existing
define
structure
size?
We're
size.
talking about, how many, didn't we say we're talking 4?
7
There are
times.
4 of them or 7 of them?
potentially 7. I can't tell you they're all grain bins.
These grain bins were probably built when corn made 50 bushel an acre. Now you're talking 200 bushel an acre, and you're limiting them to the size of their 50 bushel yield. You can't do that.
And since it's a conditional use, I don't think we need to put the size in there.
No.
When it comes in front of the board on the conditional use can
Yeah.
decide if it's too
I
big or
think
too
that's
small.
fair.
If you leave it as a conditional use on that standpoint,
Most people are gonna take 4 government bins and turn them into one 30,000 bushel bin. And it's gonna leave a smaller footprint just because it goes more vertical.
yeah, more than likely that is what you're going to see. And again, I'm really speculating here to say how many of them there were. All I remember is that 2.5 years ago when I drove around there and marked down what was happening out there, this was an ag site. There's some ag buildings here. 9 out of 10 times whenever I drive out and see ag buildings, it's either a place where there's animals or there's a grain bin. And in this case, I marked it a place that has animals. So it's not animals. Bottom line, my experience, that's what happens too. They're going to take down 2 small bins and replace them. In some cases, they may want to go with just a new bin too at a site too. So that's going to be the next question. But as of now, it sounds like the idea is reconstruction of structures is okay as a conditional use.
But Luke, I think if we leave it like it is, we need to clarify because my recollection is in the definition of structure includes your residence. So reconstruction of structures other than your residence, that has to be modified to,
Dwelling is the
Yeah.
defined term. And
yeah.
that's, I have language.
So we're going to
Yeah.
split that. We're going to split that into reconstruction of dwelling, reconstruction of
Mhm.
any structure other than a dwelling is how we'll have that. And would be a conditional use. So reconstruction of a dwelling is that. Reconstruction of any structure that's not a dwelling is a conditional use. We okay with that?
Sounds reasonable.
Okay. So that question is answered, and we're right on track. Last question. As far as I see it, this is the infamous last words here. What about new egg structures? We're okay with the idea that they're done? There's no new egg structures out there.
In Zone A. We're not
In
talking.
Zone A, yep,
We're
in
just
that-
talking Zone A
Right.
here.
Primarily that area east of town.
And Luke, could you refresh us how many sites do we have?
Well, sites right now, there are 28.
Okay.
However, keep in mind, less concerned with the sites that are as concerned with the sites that don't have anything as we are that do have anything.
Sure.
And the one thing, just from a standpoint, I'll tell you, one of the points that, and I'll tell you, I brought this up because it was brought up to me during subcommittee, is that for involved with the city to keep it into perspective, to understand why it may or may not be a big deal with county looking at it, is that the county, you're not the only wellhead protection district that the county's got. And so from that standpoint, they've got to look at it from a standpoint that they may have the same question come up in other parts of the county. That's why it was brought up to me that I was like, oh, we better ask those questions. So as of now on the sites, though, are we okay with the idea that there's just no new structures? We'd just be replacing what we got?
Want to see a show of hands?
Go for it, yeah. Should how many think it should be prohibited to build a new ag structure in this area? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. How many think they should be allowed in some form to be new ag structures built in this area?
As a conditional use?
Any form at this point? How many think they should be allowed to be built, new ones? We got 2 willing to raise their hand on that. So as of now, the standpoint is that general consensus would be that they need to be new sites in the wellhead protection district would be prohibited. I apologize, I don't have the total number of acres. I know I gave it to you in the subcommittee. I wish that I could remember what it was. We're talking about an area of 1, 2, 3. The
Luke?
number 3,000 sticks out in my mind. About 3,000 acres is all we're talking about.
The question I would have is, you referenced egg structures. What about the accessory structures? Because I'm thinking of an acreage that all of a sudden they want to put up a 5,000 square foot shed. How are we going to handle those? I mean, we're saying no new structures. So it's not just egg structures, but it'd be that individual that has the acreage that wants to put up a large shed for whatever reason.
Yeah, I do want to make it clear. It says no structures may be constructed in Zone A unless specifically allowed as a permitted or conditional use. Bottom line is no. That's a hard no. That can't be built the way it's written. There are no commodity sheds. There are no big garages. There's no new man caves, anything like that. That's not happening out there.
I think some of the reason we did that in the subcommittee was basically the policing prospect of what somebody builds a man cave, so to speak, and the next owner says, no, it's going to be an automotive repair shop of my own. And all of a sudden you have some issues with the property, or I'm going to store some chemicals in there that nobody knows about. It was an issue of policing those particular buildings after they were built down the road that we wanted to prevent. And I think that's where the original thoughts came from, is you can't guarantee the future use of that facility. It might be, I just want to put my trophies in there from something.
And I think that's the point. It's regulating the use after the use that doesn't require any sort of a permit, and it through a transfer of ownership or a creative idea, all of a sudden you're potentially introducing something into an area that previously wasn't there. And so it may not necessarily be the first owner. They have great intentions, but we're not going to live in the same house forever. Somebody's going to eventually have it. And it's that transition where it turns into a home occupation where they're running a motor vehicle repair shop, or it starts out as a seed company. Pretty soon now they're a fertilizer distributor or something, because they're able to store a significant amount of chemicals within a building or something.
So we're talking all detached structures, anything from a commodity shed all the way down to the shed that rolls off the back of a trailer from Lowe's.
Correct.
There was a square footage size that you can still have. It was small. I can't remember what the size is.
Yeah, it was essentially a pump house is about it, is what we ultimately got to.
Does that change anybody's feelings on the matter?
Okay, well, 7:24, I promised I was leaving in 6 minutes. And those were honestly the questions that I had that I really felt like we had to pound through. Are there any uses, any things in this area that we feel like we need to? I want to clarify and thank you for reminding me. Current language does say replacement of existing structures as a conditional use. So if we do have an existing, and I remember how that came to be because we were talking about some of the existing uses out there that weren't just houses, how we were going to handle those. And a good way was to review them as a conditional use, maybe not necessarily so we can shut them down, but in order to make sure that they are being managed in a way that's going to work out for the area. I do remember that discussion now. So
Would you bring up on the screen the permitted and conditional uses again, just so that everybody
Certainly.
can see those?
there you go. There are your permitted uses and there are your conditional uses. And while you're reading those, I will do my best to try and capture in notes what we've said here, but we have said the replacement of existing dwellings up to the existing size and including an increase of 25% of gross floor area is a permitted use. That would be added. And then as conditional use, it would be reconstruction of non-dwelling structures is basically how that's going to read. I've got to figure out a nicer way to say that. In existence on the date of the adoption, provided the application is made within 1 year of the removal or destruction of the structure. And that does account for the standpoint of accidentally removed or removed on purpose.
Would accessory structures be appropriate terminology for that? Or
Not necessarily, because egg structures are in some cases considered primary and in other cases considered accessory. And again, remember, part of the reason we had that on there was because we have our cell towers that are in the wellhead protection district as well. And rather than have that, it was cell towers, and it was also, I think there's a commercial use out there in some form as well, if I remember right, in order to do that by conditional use if they had to rebuild on that. So it's not a new building, but it's a replacement of those couple of primaries. We only had 2 or 3 primaries that weren't houses or ag.
Is 1 year enough, or should that go 3 years like our standard conditional use?
Well, we're really, my argument on this is that by doing this, we're treating them like they're non-conforming. Let's face it. Non-conforming is more like a year. They do not have to have a permit within that period of time. They have to make an application within that period of time. Essentially, they have to declare that they plan on doing that. Is what it amounts to. And so your question, to me, that would be my answer. You're the ones that need to answer it, though. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I was going to think if anybody's going to rebuild, they should know within a year if they're going to do it. I mean, and again, it's not, this is to get the permit. We had the discussion last time. It's not to complete construction or complete the rebuild. It's only to apply for the permit. I think 1 year is reasonable restriction on that. Otherwise, you start getting too long and then memories fade and everything else.
We okay?
And then on this structures deal,
Mm-hmm.
they can add a building, but size of a pump house. So one of these 3 farms has 25 cows. There's a storm coming. He goes to Runnings, buys a calf shelter. He can't put it out there because it's 8 by 24.
According to this ordinance, no, we can't.
But there's no foundation. There's no
Still a
sets on the
structure.
ground.
Still a structure.
So are we giving these people tax rebates on their land, the valuation, because of taking away everything they would normally be able to do? But because they're over the well protection area, they can't do, but we're going to tax them at the same rate as the guy across the road that can do whatever he wants to with his?
I would assume that's not the intent.
Well, I mean, I don't know, I'm just asking, but I mean, to me, that's, taxes are taxes.
You've taken a lot of things away from these people and devalued their property considerably, and they have nothing to show for it. And a lot of them people were there before the wells were there.
Yeah, but they weren't there before the aquifer was there.
Correct.
I mean, the aquifer's been there for
But
ever.
there was no wellhead protection area when their family moved there in 1900. And now all of a sudden, where they had a nice farm, they can't do anything anymore. That's a taking.
Well,
There has to be some compensation somehow. If you go buy the whole place, I don't have any problem with it. And if they move somewhere else at their own free will, that's fine. But I just don't like this when you just tell them they can't do this with their property when they were there first.
One of the things with taxation evaluation would be the Office of Equalization.
Yeah.
Could take that under consideration if it were necessary. And they would
Nobody
have
would be
some,
prohibited from making that argument. I
Yeah.
understand your argument. I mean, but that's an argument to be made to Declaration of Equalization. I mean, we don't want to risk water sources for that either. We're talking about our source of water
I
here.
don't want to risk the water. All I'm saying is, are we taxing it at the same rate?
And again, that's for a question for the Director of Equalization.
It is a
What I'd like-
question, and I don't think that we're allowed to vary in valuation of ag property from the productivity standards that are set forth in the statute. I don't think we get to say,
there would be some state statutes.
yeah, I don't think we can do that.
What I'd like to see is every time that something comes up and somebody wants to build a different house out there or something, you people buy his property with a high enough value so he can go somewhere else and have exactly what he had there. Then I don't have a problem with it. But when you just tell them they can't do it and they're left there with no value and they can't do anything, that's not fair.
Well, I don't agree that they're left with no value. They're going to allow to be rebuilt here and to the extent of 25% increase. I mean, they're not left with no value, but they just can't do anything more.
But if
Just
they're
like
hi-
in town, we got zoning in town. I mean, the zoning rules have come into existence in every city. Well, you got zoning out in the county. Well, those are rules that are imposed upon people. I mean, they all affect you. And here we're talking about protecting the water source for everybody. I mean, that's what we're worried about here.
that if their house was built in 1970 and they had a house that, say they had 4 people living there. 4 people in 1970 were probably living in a pretty small house. 4 people nowadays want a house substantially bigger than that, and you're telling them they can't have that. There's no more people living there. There's no more contamination, no bigger septic system, nothing other than just a bigger house, and you're telling them they can't have it.
Well, it's not me telling anybody anything. That's the ordinance, because that's the ordinance that already exists anyway. Everything we're talking about is already in place.
But standards now are a whole lot different than when a lot of them houses were built.
We have a lot of those same issues even in the city ordinances. You can't build a bigger house because of setbacks and lot sizes and so forth, so you can't buy a house and say, my family's bigger. They have a variance, I suppose, in some cases, but
It's actually more
still
stricter
regulated.
in the city that if you have a non-conforming property and it's destroyed by, I believe it's 50% of the assessed value, you can't rebuild unless you bring it into conformance with the current zoning regs. And ordinances change over time. And so we do see this, especially in the more central part of the community where the structures were built prior to zoning, and a lot of times they don't meet any of the setback requirements and such. And so there is the variance process in place for some of those instances. I think the one thing I'd like to remind everyone, it's not really the role of the bodies up here to determine values and things like that, taxation. The responsibility of the planning commission is really to look at the land use. Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? And what sort of regulations should be applied to those areas? That's for another body to determine if there's takings or values or taxation purposes or something like that. But it's to look at is the appropriate use for that location.
So the next time we Next time we meet, we will be discussing residences on small lots in a confined area of the joint jurisdiction area south of the city of Brookings. That'll be the next item. It is a kind of a new concept, new thing that was discussed. A lot of time spent discussing it, and that'll be the next thing we discuss. If we do somehow make it through that in the hour next time, then we'll move on to the regulations regarding concentrated animal feeding operations within the joint jurisdiction area. That would be the next item. So that is that's the thing we've got on tap next.
Well, quickly, Richard, for the April meeting, will the county be moving their, or are we going to just stick with 6:30?
Our meetings move to 8 p.m. in April, so you guys want to stay at 6:30 or go to 7, or it'd be actually 7 o'clock then the joint would meet.
And from the city's staff perspective, we would kind of evaluate the agenda and adjust accordingly. So we could potentially move our meetings back to start, if it's a light agenda, 6:30, and then start the joint meeting at 7. Or if it looks like it's a heavy agenda, we may need to start at 5:30 and then power through and be done by 7 to start the joint meeting. So we can adjust however is needed. But for the county, it sounds like, would 7 work better for the county?
Figuring 7 for April. And what, sorry, what date is that? April, what's that? The
7th, I
7th?
believe.
Okay. That works for me.
Well, seeing nothing else on our agenda, unless I hear opposition from the city, I will declare our meeting adjourned. We are adjourned.
Move something different.
Yeah, I know. Wish I had thought to bring that.